Die bhagard agus fáilte staachadí an priniú paibli siad an údar as pólí nach de sean tríú priniú paibli imléna godísio. Ó bhí mar le chéile go electrónach an údernach ar nó dunnach cmóra cúblíon fihead ó hen ar maríoch an Garda McCabe in Adara agus blian ó cailech an Garda Harcan Castan an Rivig. Agus cuioine míid ar a siúd agus cuioine míid cumá ar na Gardaí a cailech agus a maríoch san tréimhse idir an dá ó cáid son. You're very welcome to this, the third public meeting this year of the Policing Authority of Ireland. Still, alas, electronically gathering, and let us hope that the day is not far off when we will meet in person. Since we last met in May, the Garda Síochána has marked the 25th anniversary of the killing of Garda Jerry McCabe and the wounding of his colleague Garda Ben O'Sullivan in Adair, and a year since the killing of Garda Colm Harkin in Castlereagh. We remember them today as we remember those other members of the Garda Síochána whose lives were taken from them in the intervening years. And now we turn to the business of today's meeting and the importance of the engagement between the policing authority in the exercise of its statutory oversight responsibility and the Commissioner and his senior colleagues in the Garda Síochána. The first item that we are engaging with today is one of very significant seriousness and significance, and it is the issue of the cancellation, the unwarranted cancellation of a range of 999 emergency calls. And I think it's important briefly at the introduction to this meeting, particularly for those who may not be as familiar with some of the detail as others, to give a brief sense of the context that brings us to today and the developments that have taken place since first this was identified. And I want to make two really important points at the beginning of these brief introductory words. And the first is that nothing that I say today or that any of us says today at this meeting is in any way intended to diminish the significance of the 999 emergency call service or its importance in the life of this community. It is precisely because it is such a vital part of the life of this community and such an important resource for people who are in difficulty or distress or facing emergencies that we must be as certain as possible that it works in every respect as it is intended to work. And the second thing is that although, and we may touch upon this in the discussion, some of what we say will sit oddly with what has been reported on and what has been achieved through Operation Fuishiv during the COVID-19 pandemic. Nothing that we say today diminishes the appreciation of that work on which the authority has spoken with considerable force and support and commendation in every one of the reports that have been submitted to the Minister on the policing of the COVID-19 health emergency. And I think it's important to make those points very clearly. The first intimation the authority had that there was a problem in relation to 999 calls was in December of last year, when we were advised that there was an issue. The impression that we got was that it was mainly technical in nature. And what prompted it was the advice to us was that there was likely to be a media report to this effect. We subsequently were written to, and that was the essence and the substance of the approach that was taken to us at the time. We discussed it at a December meeting, the authority. It was indicated that it would be at least 3 months before there would be any detail, and we tabled it for discussion at the March meeting, the authority. The Minister asked the authority to report regularly to her on this issue and on our oversight of it. And I wrote to the Minister in February. At the March meeting of the authority, we had the first intimation that there may be an issue of substance and seriousness in this. And that was an inference we drew from an observation that was made at that meeting. We now know that the seriousness and the substance about which we began to have an apprehension in March had been widely understood within the organisation from October. And it has been a source of significant concern and, not to put a tooth in it, fairly intense frustration that it has been very difficult, that no approach was made to us in that regard, no unveiling of that information was done, and that it has been difficult until very recently to get substantive and comprehensive information in relation to what was happening. And we know that it was in the 8th of October, Chief Superintendent Laura Mangan began an examination of calls in the DMR of the 7th of October. And that identified for her the extent to which there were issues with priority 1 calls. And from then on, it became very quickly very clear that this was an issue that needed to be addressed across the country in the 4 control rooms, and that there was a significant issue in relation to domestic violence calls, not exclusively those, of course. Also that there was that the process of cancelling calls was not evenly distributed among those who had that capacity at the time. That is to say that some cancelled disproportionately more than others. And at the meeting in April, it became clear that to the Chief Executive and to me that we needed a more substantive briefing in relation to this in terms of seeing the process of review that was being undertaken. Separately but simultaneously, the Commissioner had a similar view, and we talked about it. And then Authority Member Shalom Binchy and Margaret Tumulty of the Executive and I went to Harcourt Square for a comprehensive briefing. There's no point in giving an immense amount of detail in this respect, but I just want to make the following few points about what happened subsequently. There was a meeting in May which was profoundly dissatisfying from our point of view, because knowing what we knew, what had been illuminated by that session in the Dublin Metropolitan Region Control Centre, that is to say that there were, as I say, significant issues of domestic violence, that the scale of that was appreciated at that time, and that there was also an issue of the quality of the response to individuals who were making emergency calls in distress, and that this was an issue that had not been identified at any stage as being a source of concern, and it is one that must be a source of concern and is, I have no doubt, to the authority, and is, I hope, and I know it is now, to the Garda Síochána. We subsequently visited the other three regional control centres. I went to Galway, Chief Executive went to Waterford, and Margaret Tumulty and another colleague went to Cork. And we want to record our appreciation of the facilities extended to us and the briefings that were given to us. And we had a range of further meetings with the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioners and the regional ACs and other colleagues to get a fuller understanding. And I am happy to say that the supply of information became much more complete, but there is still much that we have to learn about this. And for the purposes of today's meeting, our focus is on issues that touch upon the service ethos of the Garda Síochána, the recognition of the reality of victims, the recognition of the fact that nobody rings 999 casually, that for many people to telephone 999 is an act of courage, is one that takes a degree of steeling of self to be able to do it, and that very many people who ring 999 are in conditions of stress, distress, anxiety, fear, and the capacity of call takers and those who deal with them to respond in those circumstances with understanding, with empathy, with sympathy, and with respect are crucial elements of the service and are as significant as any of the other issues that arise to be considered. And we want also to look at issues in terms of the process of constant evaluation of performance, the system issues that may arise. And we know that the decisions that are complex and that have caused problems are human decisions. What was presented initially as being perhaps in the main a technical consideration has not manifested itself in any technical sense to us. And there have been people who have been able to deal extremely well, effectively and professionally with 999 emergency calls. That's as much as I think I want to say. At this stage, and colleagues will engage further with you, Commissioner, and your colleagues, and I just invite you now to make your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair. Obviously, this is regarded and is a very serious situation in Garda Síochána. Our review into the calls of service is ongoing, so we have not got the conclusive or final figures, but it is right to say that in some instances, Garda Síochána did not provide the standard of service to victims, particularly of domestic abuse, that is required by our policies and our procedures. And those policies and procedures are put in place as domestic abuse is often a crime which involves episodes and instances which carry over, which can carry on throughout a relationship. It is very rarely an individual instance, and therefore then we have particular processes which give additional protections. We are still, as I've said, working through this situation in terms of visiting all of these calls, those that have been marked within and cleared as being cancelled, and we're working through those now at a divisional level. That work is carrying on, but I think the thing which alarms me and which alarms my colleagues is that the full level of support as set out, as I've said in our policies, at times was not provided. Who may have been impacted by this, we're going to take whatever action is necessary in terms of support that we put in place. Can we follow through on prosecutions, referrals to other agencies such as TUSLA or other NGOs who may provide support. And as we carry on this, we'll obviously keep yourselves and the Police Authority, but also Minister for Justice updated on our progress. But I just want to assure victims of domestic abuse that Garda Síochána is here for you, and also please report to us if you're a victim of domestic abuse. We have put in place a very significant operation. We've put in place resources to deal with domestic abuse. We have protective services in every division. We have a National Protective Services Bureau. We have staffed those bureaus, and we've made sure that they're appropriately trained. And last year, overall, we saw a 25% increase in our interventions. So there's a lot for us to do in terms of dealing with this situation. But it was discovered in October. A fix was put in place in terms of the supervision of calls and CAD incidents in the control room. And now we are working through to make sure that victims in the interim period 2020 into 21 have received the necessary service from us, given the initial call that they made to Garda Síochána. And if I may I hand over to Andrew for a very short presentation just to set out some of the finer detail in respect of this, please.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Andrew?
Andrew, go.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, if perhaps the slides could be shared. Okay, thank you. You can move on to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to take a few minutes, about 5 minutes or so, just to provide some context. You just put it into presentation mode. Thank you. Next slide. Just to provide some context and some terminology for the discussion that's going to follow. So the key point about this is that while the discussion may touch on 999 calls, the key point is that that is the opening point in the life cycle of an incident, and we do very much understand that it takes courage and to make that call in the first instance. But once a call is received, it then turns into an incident very quickly. The priority is to focus on dispatching units or resources as required to deal with the emergency incident. And really of particular importance, and I think what's going to, where we need to focus the discussion will be on the nature of the way then that incident is recorded and it's dealt with. And in particular, the way that the emergency incident is closed off, the nature of the closure report, because what happens with that is that dictates the next step in the process in terms of follow-up. The priority is to close off emergency incidents quite quickly, but that again is only the beginning of a full incident life cycle. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the Chair has already touched on this, that the issue was identified during a review of business processes in preparation for the development of a new CAD system, the CAD2 system, and the incidents primarily dealt with, as the Commissioner said as well, incidents being prematurely closed, either by being marked cancelled or having their status set to info or information. These, as I said earlier on, primarily focus on the dispatch stage or the on-scene stage. So it's gone beyond the stage when a call was being dealt with by a call taker. It's primarily being dealt with at that stage by a dispatcher and the on-scene units. And as again the Chair touched on, there's a separate but related issue, obviously, of the nature of the interaction between the call taker and the victim. If you could move on, please. Okay, to the timeline. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so just to focus on how we got then, I suppose, from October to the current point, the immediate priority, given the potential for victim impact, was to make sure that that a fix was put in place so that it was not possible to change the status of domestic abuse calls or domestic violence calls, or else to cancel those incidents. So that change was put in place. That moved on then in December to focusing very much on which of the incidents might be most likely to cause an impact on victims, which are the most vulnerable victims, and from that a set of incident types, in particular DVSA, domestic violence, but also health issues and missing persons were identified as the key issues. So from December to May then, there was a detailed preparation stage of incident by incident life cycle, incident by incident record gathering, including the incident details and of course the recordings of the calls themselves. There were also at that stage victim or learnings from the process and reinforcement of awareness around the rules, particularly in the control centres. Since then as well, the process of dip sampling by supervisors, checks by supervisors, has been very much formalised. And during that period, a 6-stage process of these incident by incident reviews kicked off. Initially an internal review, but we'll touch later on the impact of that review process. In parallel with that, starting in January, we started a top-down data process to extract the full details of every single CAD record. It's just worth touching on that CAD is quite an old system, dates from the 1980s. That process took quite a considerable amount of time and skill in order to extract it. The results of that, and some of which we're going to share now, have only been available for the last couple of weeks, but not to say, of course, that the incident by incident reviews were carrying on. So, and what's happening at the moment is that incident by incident review is reaching its final stages with the outreach to victims. So we'll touch on that later. If you can move on, please. Okay, so the outcome of the review is, of course, where any immediate action was needed, that it was taken, but really trying to establish 3 key questions. Was a service delivered to the victim? Were the correct protocols followed, in particular the way that the incident was closed off, because that dictates the next stage of the process. And then finally, the nature and the quality of the interaction between the victim and the call taker. If you could move on again. Okay, so the key findings from the process, and this is again based on the top-down analysis, is that there was a 14% cancellation rate prior to the change being put in place, and that was in 2019 and 2020. That was reduced then to 6% after the change was put in place, and in particular for domestic violence, that went from 5.9% cancellation rate down to 2%. And the cancellation rate, of course, does change for incidents, does change depending on the nature of the incident, because some incidents are much more likely to have multiple reports and duplicate reports. And that's the primary reason why an incident might have been cancelled legitimately, that there were multiple reports of the same incident. It's just worth, again, just kind of re-emphasising that that the majority of the closures take place at the incident handling stage, where a dispatcher, and in many cases multiple dispatchers, and at least two people were involved in most of these cases, deciding whether to dispatch units and then following up with those units as they're on scene. If you could move on again, please. Okay, so the key points and just some of the key figures on this to give you an idea of the scale. In total, in 2019 and up to October 2020, 1.4 million incidents at 14% cancellation rate, or those incidents being marked with a final closure type of cancelled. There were 202,000 of those. The cancellation rate, as I said, dropped from that 14% to 6% and has been sustained since at 6%, and we're 6%, and we're happy that that is basically the minimum level that it needs to be at. But it depends a little bit by incident, and again, for DVSA domestic violence, it dropped from 6% and is currently, and has been ever since, at 2%. So the end result of this was that 3,120 DVSA incidents had a final status marked as cancelled. We are also still in the process of looking at the info type. So if you just want to move on to the last slide, and we'll wrap up. Okay, so the kind of the outcome of this in terms of numbers and where we're at with the reviews is that so far we've confirmed that 35% of those incidents were valid cancellations. That again, primarily to do with the incidents having been confirmed as duplicates of other ones that were fully recorded. The process at every stage of the 6-stage process that I mentioned earlier on is that unless there's conclusive evidence that the closure status was valid, then it's assumed to be invalid as we progress to it. So 45% in total of the incidents were sent to divisions for checks. They've completed 32%, so about 2/3 of that so far, and overall 10% of victims have been communicated with at this stage, and that process is still ongoing. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Andrew,
Okay.
and thank you, Commissioner. Can I just say one other thing by way of clarification for those who are listening or viewing this meeting? The focus today in that presentation has been on those cancelled calls that related to domestic violence and sexual abuse, because they were the accorded the priority of being looked in detail from the outset. But the priority one calls that were cancelled include a whole range of other areas as well. For example, armed incidents, serious collision, crime against the person, and so on. And in addition to which, there are lower priority cases, but nonetheless significant issues. So this is a topic to which we will be returning as a deeper analysis becomes available of the whole range of calls and types of calls that were involved in this issue. And I'm not sure that I said it, but let me, even at the risk of repeating myself, let me say it now. We have said throughout, and I've said it in a number of letters to the Minister on this topic, that we applaud the seriousness with which this issue is being dealt with within the Garda Síochána, the careful case-by-case evaluation, what I have described as the painstakingly cautious approach that's being adopted, and the quality of cooperative engagement between the policing and data management sides of the or not sides, but sections within the organisation. We recognise the intensity of the work that's being done, and we know that it will take some more time before we have the full analysis of all of the cases. I simply wanted to say that by way of a further elaboration of the context within which this conversation is taking place. And I'm opening to my authority colleagues. I think Shalom Binchy is going to ask the first, or be the first to engage with the Commissioner.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair. I just want to start with addressing this issue of whether this was a technical problem, because that was raised at the outset when this was brought to our attention. And I just want to ask you, Commissioner, from the information that's been provided to us to date, it would seem that the calls were cancelled by individual dispatchers and call takers, and that the way that they did that was to categorise them in either as cancelled or as info. Those two options were available to them on the CAD system, and that's where the problem initiated. Is that your understanding?
Yes, and just to add to that, as Andrea set out, there's also interaction then with those Gardaí who would have responded on the ground as well. And I think initially, the commentary about this all being with the handlers and that, or the call takers, and that's not correct. The dispatchers were involved in the great majority of them, and also then Gardaí on the ground also responded. And so I think the technical issue for us with the CAD system is its age and the difficulty then of interrogating that for supervision type purposes. It has, in effect, gives us no management information, and it is to be replaced next year. But it does its function in terms of managing incidents, but it provides nothing in terms of management information for supervisors to watch what's happening. And so the particular review had to be done of CAD to see the end destination of incidents before then this was discovered. So a technical solution will make sure this doesn't happen again, but a lot of this is actually down to the human interaction, or the great majority of it is down to the human interaction between a number of individuals, and I would say then the failure to comply with our policies, and our policies are very proper policies in respect of domestic abuse, and making sure we provide an appropriate follow-up.
Okay, well, if I could just follow on from that, just on your policies, in particular in relation to domestic violence and sexual abuse, I think it's correct to say that there's a policy that those calls should never be cancelled because there may be an issue, for example, of coercion or something in the background, so they should always be followed up. Is that correct?
Yes, so the obvious risk is that someone makes a call and then in effect is intimidated or coerced, etc., through threats to make a subsequent call to cancel. And so it is our policy that we should always attend, and indeed that one can hear that being explained over the 999 system to callers. But the issue for us is that some of those calls were cancelled on the result as a basis of a second call being received, but some also were cancelled because the situation seemed all quiet, and some were cancelled because at the house that Gardaí were calling to, they met a very hostile reception and were told to, in effect, clear off in no uncertain terms. But all of those should have moved across the pulse, so there should have been, even if on the night we could find nothing more, there was a subsequent follow through. So that is a particular issue of this, yeah.
And is that one of the impacts or fallouts from this, that calls which should have been moved on to Pulse from the CAD system weren't because they were prematurely cancelled?
Well, I think that's, for me, that's, and for all of us, that's one of the principal fallouts, is that when a call didn't move from the CAD system onto our Pulse system, when it moves on to Pulse, then there's a whole array then of additional supervision and additional requirements, and that includes callbacks, but also then when an incident is Pulse, Pulse then can connect addresses, it can connect individuals, and we're able to do a far more thorough analysis of what has happened at a particular address or with a particular named individual. And there's sort of 5 sort of important points of information on Pulse. CAD cannot give the operator a premises history, for instance. So, to put an address onto CAD isn't going to say, we've been there, over 4 times in the last 6 months. So it's Pulse genuinely where the information lies. Not moving across the Pulse, you're missing out then, and subsequent calls are also missing out on the information that should have been gleaned.
Okay. And also you mentioned there that there is, under the banner of human interaction, that there was an issue with a number of individuals. On your review so far, has it emerged that certain individuals were disproportionately cancelling large number of calls?
The great majority are within a certain percentage tolerance. There are some outliers, and we will have to explore that further in terms of why that is. But one individual may not own a call from start to finish. An individual who's particularly active may, and a dispatcher or handler, but say in this case a dispatcher may open a series of calls to see what's happening with them, to close them again. And so we don't want to rush to judgment on that. Certainly there are outliers there, and we need to seek an explanation as to why that is. But in the first place, we wanted to make sure we got this victim piece done, and that's underway at the moment. But there's a second piece then in terms of the quality of individuals' work, and the obvious outliers are a place to start.
Okay, we might come back to that. You described that you've put a fix in place, and that fix is ensuring that only a supervisor can now cancel calls. Is that correct?
Well, I think beside that as well, I might look to Andrew just so it's a really accurate description of it. We also created a further set of closure codes and eradicated then in effect, well, not entirely, there's still cancellation is still a valid closure code in certain circumstances. Andrew, can you help?
Well, maybe before we go to Andrew, because what I really want to know is, is that an adequate response? Is merely taking away the function of cancelling from the individual call takers and dispatchers and placing that solely in the hands of one supervisor per unit? Is that an adequate response to a situation where there's a very high number of domestic violence and sexual abuse calls being cancelled, and where there's potentially individuals, outliers, as you described them, who are cancelling those calls? Is that an adequate response, even at an interim stage?
Well, I think if the rate of cancellation was remaining the same, I would say it wasn't, but the rate of cancellation has dropped in the domestic violence, domestic abuse area to, I think, approximately 2.6%. So there's been a considerable reduction, and that the reduction has also been reflected in other areas as well. So the alternative clearance codes plus then the additional supervision in effect has, as I would say, worked. There would not be a situation where there are no cancellations, because duplicate calls, etc., can happen. But we have moved to a position where I think our closure is in a much stronger place. So I'm satisfied with that. There is a vast volume of calls do come into us. Like we are talking here over 1.4 million CAD incidents, which are 999 calls and calls to station and calls received in person. So we have to be able to deal with the volume, and we have to be sure then the supervisors are engaged. But part of that driving the behaviour is the technology they work with, and what is open to the discretion of the individual, and what requires a supervisor to sign off.
Okay, now I want to move to just a slightly separate issue. Have you yourself listened to a sample of these calls?
Yes, I have, yes.
Okay, and can I ask you two things? One, would you accept that people are making calls in very fraught, difficult situations, and in some cases it must have been extremely difficult for them to make those calls?
Well, yes, very, very clearly. And one only has to listen to a few of the calls, and some of them are harrowing calls. We recognise that in terms of the training that we've provided for our staff, and it is a very stressful environment to work in as well. There's a lot of very difficult situations and circumstances are dealt with by the staff, and that is inevitably because of the amount of traumatised, shocked, injured individuals that they are dealing with through the 999 system. The 999 system does get a rapid response and does get a quick response, and it is an emergency call as well. And so there is an imperative on the handler to extract information quickly as well.
Commissioner, can I ask you, did you yourself have any concerns about the quality of the call taking when you listened to those calls?
Well, yes, I did. Yes, and as a result, and I've spoken then to the regional ACs in respect of the training that was provided, and I think the training that was initially provided, when I look through the curriculum and the extent of that training, I believe that was good training. Certainly now it needs further refresh. There's a piece then just about the active supervision of the quality of the calls and the exchanges that are happening as well. And in effect, then a quality performance or a rationale, or sorry, a review of people's performance in terms of the quality of their interactions as well. So I think there's some more support that has to be provided for that staff. To
be clear on that, sorry to interrupt you, Commissioner, but just to be clear on what the issues are there, would it be fair to put them into two categories of one, the quality of the information being taken? So in some instances, were there problems with correct names being taken, correct addresses being taken, so that type of quality? And secondly, was there an issue with the tone in which those conversations were conducted? Was there a lack of empathy and understanding evident from some of the calls that you listened to?
Well, if in terms of the quality of the information, if I expanded to all the incidents that I've looked at, certainly there's been an issue around addresses, recording of phone numbers, recording of actual numbers, house numbers. And when one hears the calls, some of the information provided is very indistinct and is difficult. But certainly within this group, we have found that numbers have been recorded incorrectly, and therefore then addresses where there may be incidents ongoing have not been located by those who've been dispatched the call. So that's of particular concern, but then that should be immediately flagged back into the control room so further inquiries might be made against the name, any further records that we might have, because we do have records on Pulse. In terms of the tone in conversation, yes, of course, the tone is important, absolutely, but there's also then the issue of the expediting the call, because it is often isn't a call for an emergency response, and so quickly obtaining the information so that assistance can be rapidly dispatched. So there is a balance. And it's an unusual sort of call center environment because speed often is of the essence as well as quality, and as well as obviously an appropriate tone, which in effect reassures and hopefully settles the individual.
And I think you've accepted that there was, in some cases, people just simply didn't get the service that they needed. Have you identified in any way what the range of adverse impacts have been for the callers whose calls were cancelled that you've identified by this review, please?
Well, if we have to look to the response that people received once they called and Garda Síochána. I think what's important to say is here we have and to repeat myself in some ways, we have an important set of policies and principles in respect of dealing with domestic abuse, because of the very nature of the vulnerability of the victim, and because these are incidents which can be ongoing and last over weeks, months, or indeed years. So therefore then the policies we have in place are there to make sure that we protect people. And I think whenever something then is recorded as cancelled, no matter what happens out in the ground or what has happened over the phone, then immediately we've lost the opportunity to know about that incident, collate it with others, and in effect join up the dots, and therefore then the opportunity to make appropriate intervention either by ourselves, through community policing, through the domestic violence teams that we have, or through other agencies is lost. So that for me is the very significant issue in this. We are working through all of that to see practically what the impact that has had on people, but taking a very careful approach to this, and I've asked that people proceed with the view that there has been adverse impact and that they must therefore then look for that and be able to then, where we can, to address that and mitigate either risk or harm that people have been exposed to.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. I'll hand you over to my colleagues now.
Thank you.
So, Paul.
Yeah, just a couple of issues, Commissioner. Just first of all, just to clarify for me, I think in the presentation from Andrew, there was a figure of just over 3,000 DVSA calls that were cancelled. As the chair has said, there's a broader group, I think, of priority 1 calls, which would include that group. Do we know how many priority 1 calls there were?
May I look to Andrew there to provide that information, please?
We do, all right. I needed just a minute just to look that up, but yes, we do have that figure. So out of the total of 1.4 million, we'd have a breakdown of the priority 1 calls. The cancellation rate, I do know, for priority 1 calls was the same as the overall, so it's about 14%, significantly lower for DVSAs. If you give me a minute, I can get you the number of priority 1s that were set to a final type of cancelled. Okay,
well then if I just come back, Commissioner, in the meantime to touch on this issue of adverse impact. So whatever the ultimate figure of priority 1 calls, my understanding is that part of the review that's currently being undertaken by Assistant Commissioner O'Brien, I think, is that you're trying to determine whether or not there was an adverse impact caused by the cancellation of these calls. When will we know, or when will you know the answer to that question?
Well, the 3 rural regions, put it like that way, they have made good progress, but just given the numbers in DMR, in particular DMR North and DMR West, and the amount of, in effect, in-division, in-station work that had to be done, because there's a number of other routes that things may have been dealt with. So we have found instances where incidents were reported on the 999, but they also report to the station. And for instance, then a pulse incident has been found, arrests were made, and therefore at the local level, so not on the CAD system or the 999 system, an appropriate service was put in place. So that, and also then we have found that with some of the callers, we've had an ongoing connection in terms of the service that we provided and supports that we've provided as well. So that work is ongoing. I think it's of several weeks yet. If I might turn to AC DMR because and ask her, has she got a timetable for DMR in terms of the work they've undertaken?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to reassure that work is ongoing. And again, as the Commissioner has outlined, we have gone through a significant number of the incidents that have gone out. We're approximately at the stage of 50% of them have been examined by the divisional officers. So I would imagine another couple of weeks and we will be in a position to report a little bit further in terms of the adverse impacts on victims.
I could
Mr. My understanding,
just to answer your question if you want. I have the number for you.
Yes,
so
Andrew.
Out of 0.4, just over 1.4 million, 163,788 were priority 1 across a variety of incident types. And of those, 22,595 had their final status set to cancelled. So that's a cancellation rate for those incidents of 14%, as I said, which is in line with the average.
Okay, I suppose, Commissioner, my concern in relation to this is that if we take adverse impact as meaning potential harm to victims, but also potential harm to Garda investigations, at some point, this review process is going to come to a view to try to determine whether or not there was an adverse impact. Is it appropriate that that review is undertaken solely by the Gardaí, or is there room for some sort of independent external view to be involved in that process?
Well, I think there's, and we've always expected some form of external examination of the work that we've done. I think that would be entirely valid and appropriate, and I think we would welcome that, because we'd want to be sure, well, that we hadn't missed anything for a start, but secondly, then just to give further reassurance as to the depth and the quality of the work that's been undertaken here. As been said already, in October, this was discovered quickly. We put in place a fix which fixed the number of cancellations. And now we're working backwards through these incidents to try and mitigate the situation. But certainly, if there was an independent, certainly independent from Garda Síochána analysis of the quality of that work, I think that would be welcome. There's a lot at stake here, because not only is it the quality of the 999 system, but also then our response to domestic abuse. So outside analysis of this would be welcome, because we are very mindful that there's a lot of learning for us in this, in terms of behaviours and responses on behalf of members of Garda Síochána, that we have put a big priority on domestic abuse. We're in a position now where our systems allowed us to identify these cancellations, but identify this particular failing. And there's a lot for us here for us to learn from and to work through to make sure our systems improve. But also then we learn from this in terms of training provided both to those in the control rooms, but also to those responding as well. So I do regard this as being a very important issue and one to learn from. So an independent examination would be welcome in that respect.
I'm just looking at the chair to see if I have time for another question or two. One in particular, Commissioner, well, maybe two very quick things if you don't mind. I know you're still at the point where you're working through the council calls. Is there any evidence thus far of any disproportionate impact on particular groups? Media speculation that there has been a disproportionate impact on migrant community and on traveller women. Would that be a fair assumption for us to make, or is there any evidence of that so far?
I don't have the information to back that up as an assumption. I've looked at Andrew just for confirmation. I don't think that information is there for us to make a commentary on at this moment in time. I've engaged with Women's Aid. We've also engaged, in effect, with our own independent advisory group in respect of this, and we have engaged as well the travelling community. So we're very conscious of those individuals in our society who are particularly at risk from domestic abuse, and as part of the learning of this, the difficulty is just our recording of ethnicity and the lack of information that we would have in that regard. Andrew, can you further assist there?
Just to confirm what you said, Commissioner, so in an answer to your question, Paul, no, there's no evidence of any particular impact on any group, but then again, that's not information that's recorded. So CAD is about incident dispatch. It'll be at the later stage that more detailed information would exist. It would really take an incident by incident review to get at that. So something probably will come out of the incident by incident reviews, but there's certainly no top-down figures on it. No. No evidence of what you said. That's certainly not a hypothesis that we put forward.
Okay, but can I just get a degree of reassurance that that is something that is being borne in mind when the reviews are taking place?
Yes, it is, because there is, when we look at the quality of the interaction, we just want to be sure that the quality of our interaction with those, for instance, who English isn't their first language, what quality of that interaction. And obviously you can be talking to an individual, English isn't their first language, and then they are then in very stressed and difficult circumstances. So these are particular learnings that we want to take from this.
Okay, and finally for me, again, there was some media speculation that I think the suggestion was that guards that were being dispatched to some of these scenes were that there were some WhatsApp communications between some guards, essentially suggesting that cancelling calls was the way to avoid these matters going on to Pulse and therefore avoiding follow-up work. Is there any evidence thus far of that?
Perhaps not the manner in which it's reported, and if I leave that open in terms of that is something that we are watching for, because the authority would be very well aware that we put a big emphasis on callbacks. Callbacks happen when a domestic abuse incident moves on to Pulse. So the way to avoid callback is for the incident not to move on to Pulse. So I always have to be on the alert for those who haven't followed through on these procedures deliberately to avoid further work down the line. You know, and that's a facet of this. It'd be wrong to say that our mind is closed to that possibility. It's very much open to that possibility. I don't think it's as perhaps reported in the media, but it's an important element of this as we look through at the reasons to why some of these closures were recorded as cancelled, call cancelled.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. That last is a really important comment, and I know you choose your words carefully when you say perhaps not in the manner that is reported. And we will keep in touch with you on relation to that. Stephen had asked for the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, you yourself have outlined some of the range of impact that may have occurred of an adverse nature with victims. They didn't get the support when they needed it, perhaps. No victim callback, no risk opportunities for risk assessment, referral to other agencies. In the context of the review that is ongoing, obviously you're going to have a range of officers and Garda members making contact and trying to understand what happened. Can you reassure us just that those who are engaged in this review, that there are clear terms of reference, there's been a clear briefing, and that all around the country where people are making these phone calls, that there is a degree of consistency being applied and that the appropriate threshold of what would constitute adverse impact is actually being considered? So that's question one. And the second question, again, it's been alluded that one of the other adverse impacts of an information nature is that the details will not have migrated onto Pulse and therefore are not available in the future in terms of premises history, maybe the availability of weapons at that premises, for example, in some of the other category 1 calls. Is there any opportunity to retrieve that information by way of back record conversion of Pulse, or is that simply lost for time and memoriam, or have you the ability to try and fix that for the rescue that information and get it onto Pulse?
Okay, if I just speak briefly to the Pulse point, one of the reasons for retracking our steps is actually to bring Pulse back up to date. So this will add to the history either against premises or against individuals, either victims, perpetrators, or indeed, very regrettably, but it is a very much a factor in this, children who are in homes where domestic abuse is occurring. So one of the purposes of this is to retread this ground and in effect, to use an old expression, perfect our records so that our records are up to date. So we looked at Andrew and I confirm that can be done. Obviously, the record is made now as opposed to when it should have been. Andrew, there just.
Yeah, just to add to what you said there and to answer your question, Steve. So the issue, as we've touched on with this premature closure, is that the incident did not migrate correctly across from CAD with the information that it has across to Pulse. When then there would be further onus on the responding members to complete more information. So what we will do is that in any cases where it's identified that the record was in fact incorrectly prematurely closed, it will be reopened effectively on CAD, it will be pushed over to Pulse, and then the information will be completed. So it's not a case, certainly not a case of information was lost, because CAD only has a limited amount of information. So that information is still there, it hasn't been lost. That will be pushed across to Pulse, and then the Pulse record will be completed.
And just before you address the first question, just to finish that one off, then the information that is gleaned through the review, will it be added to Pulse or just what was originally on CAD?
Well, CAD is only ever the starting point. CAD has very basic information on the incident to allow the emergency incident to be processed. That's all the CAD ever has. So all of CAD's information will transfer across in the normal way, and the Pulse record then needs to be completed. So whether that's gleaned from and the onus will be on the member themselves to complete that information in conjunction with the Garda Information Services Centre. So some of that will be information from the review, but some of that, and by and large, what's happening is that the review information is being pulled from the response to the incident anyway. So it exists both in the review, I suppose, but also in the records that the members would have had. So it's in a couple of places. So it certainly hasn't been lost.
Thanks, Andrew. Commissioner.
Then the first point. Well, I would ask then, if I look to Anne-Marie Cagney, the respect of the briefing that was given to the various individuals who've been asked to make contact, I would say in practice what we're trying to do is make contact with them via a person that they're familiar with, either through community policing team or through domestic abuse team. Secondly, then I've viewed then the individual narratives, and I've seen the great detail that has been put into them in terms of what needs to be followed through on, and so that gives me a lot of confidence in the process been undertaken. But perhaps Anne-Marie, given that you have the lion's share of these in DMR, can you say what's been done in respect of uniformity?
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. Just to reassure. The briefings that took place in relation to the victim engagement, the briefings took place at national level. So there were two sets of briefings, one for the chief superintendents in each of the regions, and then one for the teams on the ground who are going to engage with victims as part of this process. And I just want to remind our colleagues that the personnel we chose to do that victim engagement piece have been trained in domestic abuse and are acutely trained in identifying the impacts of domestic abuse on victims and families impacted by domestic abuse. And again, as part of the regional briefings, we also engaged the services of our colleagues in the Garda National Protective Services Bureau, and they delivered training at that particular briefing, again to our members, on the manner in which victims are to be engaged with, to include identification of impacts and adverse impacts on victims. So, and that was done on a consistent basis to all nationally as part of that particular briefing. And then they got opportunities for a question and answer session, which was very extensive, and significant discussion went into that particular piece around victim engagement.
Thank you. Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
Valerie.
Chair, sorry, Commissioner.
Yeah, if I might say, it might also say we have there's a review checklist which runs to 3 or 4 pages. There's 44 lines of information within it that we could share that with you, plus the briefing, which runs to I think almost 50 briefing slides there. So we can share that with you, and that to maybe give you some assurance as to the detail and the quality of the briefing and the quality of work we're expecting back. Thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Look forward to that. Thank you, Commissioner. Valerie, and then Elaine afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Just briefly from me, Commissioner, I'm interested in the behavioural aspect of this, and as I understand it, you've put in a fix in terms of who can cancel a call and how it can be cancelled. Can you tell us briefly what the fix is and what's the governance over that? So who's managing the managers?
Okay. If I might look, either some of them are regional colleagues again, either Barry, are you on the call there? Can you explain the process, please?
Yes, Commissioner, just by way of explanation in terms of the technical fix with regards to what's classed as domestic violence, sexual assault incidents on CAD, they can only be cancelled irrespective of the circumstances by the sergeant. So in effect, what happens is that comes up to the sergeant's screen, who in turn has to review it and apply the decision-making model and satisfy himself or herself as to the appropriateness of the cancellation.
Okay. And how is that reviewed in terms of consistency and patterns over time going forward?
Yeah. In addition to that, we are conducting monthly reviews in respect of examining calls that have been cancelled. And that's the responsibility of the inspector in charge of the control room, who will actually look at the calls in that period of time that have been cancelled and examine the details of the calls and satisfy himself or herself as to the appropriateness of it. And then we are doing a degree of diff sampling in respect of the ECAS recordings of the calls. Again, that's we anticipate on a quarterly basis, and that will be for the purpose of examining the quality of the engagement. So at this point in time, they're the initial kind of operational oversights that are in operation of the control.
And I ask in the sense of a feedback loop, when it comes back to individual performance management with the inspector or the sergeant or the guard, will this form part of the data that will inform that conversation?
Yes, there are performance reviews being undertaken in respect of both the dispatchers and the call takers, and this information is being utilised in order to inform that performance assessment. And it's an engagement process whereby if there are issues or that's as part of a discursive process. So it's not just information, there is an engagement with each of the individual call takers and call dispatchers.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, as I understand it, in terms of call takers, you're moving to a model where it'll be Garda staff as opposed to Garda members who are performing this role. Am I correct?
Predominantly, that's correct.
So you're actively recruiting, even now, currently you're recruiting and training up new people into these roles. Yeah,
that process has commenced.
Are you satisfied that the training that you've had in place from when you started this process, that it's sufficient, or are you looking at that at all?
Yes, we are. We have an extensive initial training, induction training curriculum, but arising from this review and some of the lessons learned, we have adjusted that, and we will be undertaking ongoing training with the existing personnel and also incorporating some of the aspects that we've identified in a training program for the inductees as well. So that will and training will be ongoing in respect of that. And
I do appreciate what the Commissioner said, that on the one sense you call takers need to be sensitive to the issues and have certain interpersonal skills. On the other hand, speed is of the essence. So obviously it's particularly relevant training you need here. Can I ask just a final question? What's the shift pattern for the call takers? Do they work very long shifts?
The current shift, the shift pattern is a 12-hour shift, 4 days on, 4 days off. So the morning shift, I think, starts at 7 o'clock, finishes 7 p.m. So it's a 12-hour shift.
So in the 12th hour of the shift, if somebody's very tired, doesn't get all the correct information, how do you ensure that call is either sorted out, or that if there's a subsequent call, that it's linked to that earlier call? How do you manage the cross-shift accountability between people?
Okay, in respect of the shifts, there's quite a number of rest periods incorporated within the actual overall 12-hour shift, and then obviously in the sign over, the commencement of duty, there's a detailed briefing among obviously the supervisors and also the individual dispatchers, many of whom would operate from the same dispatch desks and would be very familiar. So as they take up duty, they will be taking on the relevant calls, of which they would be probably very familiar in terms of the type of call and the location.
If there's a call towards the end of a shift and a guard is dispatched and the service happens, the visit happens, how is that information transferred to the next guard on the next shift and the next call taker on the next shift? If there's a second call coming in, is that evident to everybody involved?
Okay. The current CAD system, the way it is calibrated on an individual call. It's a process system. So the call taker dispatcher will actually have a screen in front of them of the calls. They can interrogate the system. They actually can interrogate the system in respect of what we call the resource status or the resource history of an individual resource at a given time, but also they can actually do the incident history. So they can actually go back and examine, it would say, incident history in respect of domestic issues. So whilst the system is somewhat antiquated in technological terms, there is that search back.
Final quick question from me. If I've called, and regardless of what my situation is, it might be domestic violence, or it might be that I think there's somebody about to break into my house. If my call is cancelled, how do I know? And I'm not waiting all night.
Well, I suppose you'll know the fact if you haven't got a response.
Yeah, but I mean, when do I decide to give up hope?
Or when do you decide to give up hope? No, if you look at, we say the system, it operates in terms of a response. So we would get calls back from people in respect of
is it up to me to call back?
Yeah.
If I'm in a situation of fear, maybe I'm on my own in the house, there's somebody outside, I'm afraid of breaking in, I've called, and maybe I'm unable to make another call.
Okay, well, all of the calls, the requirement is that when the call is dispatched, the time is logged, and then it's up to the mobile to give what's known as at scene time when they arrive at the scene. And all of this is monitored by both the call dispatcher and also the supervisor who have access to that information. So if there's a backlog,
I won't know really. If somebody's not showing up, I won't know. And can I ask you, that time, the length of time, the duration, and this is Chairman, the length of time between the call is made and the arrival of the Garda member, is that monitored systematically? And do you look at trends across divisions, across units, across individuals? And it's a yes or no, really?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe we come back to that again under performance. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. But we'll come back to some of those, if not now, later. Elaine.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm in a rural area with poor broadband, so if there's problems of hearing me, I'll just revert to a picture of me and go ahead that way. Commissioner, I want to dig into why the calls were cancelled and to examine if there was any cultural issues or a mindset within the individual guards or the outliers that you've described them as. You've mentioned on a couple of occasions now about the quality of interaction. I take that to mean the empathy, the tone, and the patience of the guard taking those calls. How did you feel when you heard some of those calls?
All of these calls are difficult, and you can immediately see that individuals are in a position of fear and trauma. So that's one's initial response, and often I was left with the impression that I wasn't content with what had been said to them over the phone. But I listened to, I suppose, the outliers in terms of what was regarded as being poor quality. I can't say that I've listened to hundreds of these calls. I haven't. I've listened to a couple of dozen, maybe.
And you've made reference to a lot of learning on behaviours by the response of members. And again, just going to the mindset of the people that cancelled the calls. Is there any analysis going to be done in the review on whose calls were cancelled? Were those calls from, and one of my colleagues has touched on this already, were those calls from members of the travelling community, predominantly members of the migrant community, and people from ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or particular socioeconomic areas?
Well, I think when we, as Andrea said already, when we get back the detail of the response from the division, we'll have a lot more information then, which may be able to fill in those gaps in what our knowledge is at the moment. Those are things we just don't know when we look at a name and address in this moment in time. I think when I think about mindset, I do think there's more to be done in respect of the awareness around the particular issues and characteristics of domestic abuse. And that's an important element for us around all domestic abuse cases. And some of these were being treated more like maybe a public order incident as opposed to properly an incident which was episodic and therefore then required a far more diligent response from the organisation rather than just saying all quiet. A lot of these calls were cancelled on response from uniformed members on the ground were unable to find the incident or no complaints made or all quiet, etc. So that's the area where we need to particularly to get into as well. This isn't just an issue of the control rooms.
So do I take it, Commissioner, that in some instances domestic violence calls were minimised or to public order offences?
Well, what I'm saying is that if you go to an incident and don't follow through, if you cancel it, if you ask for it cancelled as opposed to moved across the pulse, you have in effect stepped outside our procedures. I'm not going to use the expression minimised. People have stepped out what our set procedures were, and in doing so, then we were unable to give the full response that we ourselves have set out as being appropriate for domestic abuse.
I'm going to throw you a curveball, Commissioner. Have you ever watched Inside the K?
Oh yes, I have. Yes.
What districts did the Inside the K look at?
Well, that was predominantly K district, which is Blanchardstown, etc. That was the DMR
Cabra.
West. That's DMR West, yeah.
It was a 5-part series on Virgin Media last year, and it was about 500,000 viewers. Did you notice anything about the absence of the guards on that programme?
No, I didn't. No.
It appeared to me and to others that there was no accents on that programme from that area, from the North City area. And what I'm getting at is, would you agree that there can be a perception that guards may not always mirror the communities that they serve?
We are on record of saying about how important it is that we're representative of the community that we police, and we have done specific outreach, and that's been part of our diversity and inclusion strategy, that we would become more reflective of society, and we signed up through the Public Sector Leadership Board in respect of that as well. And there's specific steps that we've taken already around, for instance, placements, etc., that we're providing, internships, etc. this year, but also then this year as well, our reserve strategy, seeking to recruit from areas where we don't have high representation, and also then what a further outreach we can do about our recruitment of members of Garda Síochána. So there's a lot happening in that space.
No, I appreciate that that's what's being done, and it's very admirable, the initiatives that you're undertaking. But in terms of the diversity of the guards as it is, in terms of the socioeconomic background, that there may be a perception that the guards don't always mirror the communities that they serve. And you have said before that the Gardaí reflect the prejudices that exist in the community. So I'm asking, what I'm trying to get at is, do some guards cancel calls because of who made them?
Well, I can't say that at this moment in time. There's a piece of work to be done with the victims, and then we'll further examine then the conclusions and results from that. If there are issues where it seems that individuals have been prejudiced, or there's a pattern of very poor behaviour or poor quality of service, then those are matters that may have to address then in effect through the discipline system. But it'd be wrong to conclude that at this moment in time, that we are at a particular moment where we are well through the victim approaches, etc. When that is finished, then we will have a far better handle on this, and where then we may be able to identify behaviour which is could be regarded as being prejudiced or discriminatory.
I just have one or two more questions. Do you know what implicit bias is?
Implicit bias, yes.
How would you define implicit bias?
Well, implicit in terms of the response that we have provided, and that bias then in a poor quality of response.
Yeah. So the definition that I have put you on the spot, sorry, but an implicit bias is a prejudice that has been formed, often unintentionally, and it can reflect a combination of personal experiences and attitudes around us that we have as we grow up. And again, coming back to what I was saying initially, perhaps we need to dig into a little bit deeper the cultural reasons or the mindset as to why calls were cancelled, whose calls were cancelled, and why those calls were cancelled.
Well, I understand entirely the point that you're making, but in terms of my response to individuals and their shortcomings, I have to be in a position of factually what they failed to do and what actually I can demonstrate that they failed to do if I'm to address that. There's another piece overall about our attitudes and how those then, I suppose, then become apparent through our behaviours. And really, I, as the Commissioner, and I expect everyone then in the organisation also to adhere to a set of behaviours that we set out in the Code of Ethics. We've backed that up now in terms of the decision-making model and the importance of the Code of Ethics and human rights and constitutional rights within that. So we've made very clear constantly the behaviours expected of individuals within the organisation. And in the first place I have to look to are what are the behaviours. And I'll look firstly to the behaviours here and see what needs to be addressed. But I do think there's a deeper piece around domestic abuse and how we respond to domestic abuse. This opens up an attitudinal piece, and I don't want to put it in description of prejudice or discrimination, but undoubtedly there's an attitudinal piece in this that we need to understand and that we can get help from in terms of the NGOs and other experts in the field, and they can help us in terms of our awareness training in respect of this.
And my final piece, Commissioner, thanks very much for that, is I just for a moment want to put the voice of a domestic violence victim at the heart of what we're doing today. And there's been some reference here to adverse impacts. I would suggest that perhaps the potential adverse impact of what has happened is that the call will never be made. And I want to read very briefly a synopsis by an individual called Agnes, who went to Women's Aid last year during COVID. And she never contacted the guards. So this is from the 2020 report. Agnes is 78 and she suffered emotional, physical and financial abuse throughout her entire life. Her married life. Her husband is 80 and her son who lives with her is 58. And these are her words. With the COVID lockdown, the situation has become even more unbearable as I feel completely trapped, suffocated, and I'm frightened of telling anyone in case matters escalate and the situation gets even worse. I haven't seen my friends in weeks. I'm feeling alone and isolated. My son is at home and there's literally nowhere to go to escape from the abuse of both my husband and my son. I feel like the only way out is to die. The stress and intensity of the situation is making me feel hopeless and desperate. I've started having flashbacks of the worst attacks from my husband, and it's giving me panic attacks. I've thought about ending my own life just to escape the situation. And the thing about Agnes is that she rang Women's Aid and not the guards. And this predates the 999 situation. And she called them because she felt that they listened and understood her. And what I would be concerned about is that women like Agnes, that their adverse impact is not that they ever could make the call in the first place, but that they will never make that call because they will feel that the person at the other end of the phone does not have the empathy or the tone or the patience or the mindset to listen and understand to what she has to say. That's all I wanted to say, Commissioner. Thank you.
Might I respond that that's why we are taking the issue of domestic abuse so seriously, because we know there are hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals in the same position as Agnes, where they're in a spiral and of abuse and fear. It's why we have invested in our domestic abuse resources through the protective service units, and also why we had Operation FISA for the last 14, 15 months, and why this in itself is so disappointing. And I apologised earlier, and I'll apologise again. People did not receive the service that they deserved and which they should have expected from us. And looking backwards, we want to make as much right of this as we can and mitigate it. But looking forward, we want to really emphasise that we're here for people, we're here for their reports, and certainly we've resolved this. And there's more work to do. There's more for us to learn from this, and there's more that we can learn in terms of improving our overall response as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I think the final is moulding, and then I'll wrap this and we'll move on to the next two items.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, my colleagues have dealt with the human dimension of this particular issue very effectively. I want just very briefly to address the governance matter. My concern is in relation to the manner of reporting on this, and then perhaps other matters. To what extent has there been interrogation figures? To what extent is it built into the culture of the organisation that figures in various areas, this being one, are interrogated to seek to reflect the true dimension of what's being reported? And my concern is that the element of reporting just goes so far, and that a great number of reports are accepted at face value, and that there isn't sufficient checking, there isn't sufficient verification in relation to what the real situation might be.
Well, I would say of this, 4 or 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had an insight into this whatsoever. CAD was introduced, and the 4 regions were introduced, and that allowed us then to have a window into this. Good work was done by Chief Superintendent Mangan in terms of the discovery of this, and then also very good work was done by Andrew Sullivan and his team to actually be in a position to interrogate a 1980s CAD system to give us this aggregate data. So there is the importance here, and this is further illustrative of finding the trends. The difficulty for us, and the difficulty for inspectors and sergeants and those supervising the control rooms, was that CAD as a process, or as a system, did not give management information. And it has to be said, a lot of our systems are in that position. We're either paper-based, or we are just in a position of moving across to computer-based systems. So you can look at the investigation management system being rolled out, but still probably for the majority of the country still there's some paper-based investigative systems. Until we move across more and more into automated ICT processes, we won't have that sort of management information. Now, I could turn to Andrew, but he would have a lot to say about our architecture of information, but maybe that there's not time.
There may not be time for that, but my concern on this, Chair, just one further question. My concern in relation to this is the potential development of a culture within an area or areas which aren't supportive of the objective of Garda Síochána and you as Commissioner. And by that, I mean that there doesn't seem to have been sufficient emphasis on, for example, training, refresher training of supervisor, emphasizing the type of behavior that you require, emphasizing the approach that should be taken in terms of engaging with very vulnerable and challenging situations and people. And my concern, Commissioner, is what you've unearthed, or that that's occurred in the recent past, maybe something that has actually developed over a significant period of time.
Well, I think some of the learning from this is, one, the need for refresher training, and secondly, the skills required for these roles are skills that should be assessed, and it's not clear that everybody would possess those skills. I think it is a particular mindset and an ability for an individual to work in such a high pressure environment. And so you're correct in what you say. More needs to be done around the suitability of both either Garda members or Garda staff for these high pressure roles, and then how do we manage that in terms of the HR functions. This isn't, you know, the question always around the discipline. This is just a question of this particular role may not be one that you are equipped for or proficient at, and there's some other role then hopefully that can be found for an individual, particularly. And I think this highlights again the importance of our control room, and this is one of the very first touches and points of contact for the public into Garda Síochána. So there are calls which you can't be very happy with how they're dealt with in the control room, and then when they move out to the Garda members who actually attend, the matter's picked up properly. There's a good quality response. But we want to be sure that every part of our response meets the standards that we expect in terms of that interaction with the public and the service that's provided, and the reassurance to them that help is at hand or is on its way.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, colleagues, and thank you to your colleagues too, Commissioner. There is no doubt that we will have further discussions both in private and in public on this topic. There is no doubting either that what has been revealed and illuminated by the spotlight that this process has placed on the way in which emergency calls are handled touches the reality of the lives of very, very many people. As I said at the beginning, it requires a particular level of stress and concern to ring 999, and it requires, in many cases, a particular strength of character to be able to bring oneself to make an emergency call to the Gardaí. And if 165,000 or thereabouts, 163,000 and something, the figure that Andrew gave, priority 1 calls were cancelled, not all of them inappropriately, but a very significant number of those would have been cancelled inappropriately. That raises a really serious issue about the perception that people have of cancelled calls. I think that we have, from the outset, once this became clear to us, the scale of it, recognised that this would need. Sorry, did I say that 165,000 priority 1 calls were cancelled? There were 165,000 priority 1 calls. But if the percentage of cancelled calls was, as in DVSA, was consistent throughout that, then a very significant number of those calls were cancelled.
I can give you the number, Chair, if you want. Sorry, it's like I said, it's almost 165,000, 164,000. Of those, 22,595 were cancelled. So it's a 14% cancellation rate. 14%. But just to say that DVSA would be substantially less than that, a 6% cancellation rate. So DVSA was at the lower end of the cancellation rates, but you're 23,000 cancellations in the priority one.
Well, then that in itself is a very significant number of calls to have been cancelled, which are priority 1 calls, which are those that you categorise as being the most significant. We share the view that there will need to be an independent review of this as soon as it's feasible that it be done, and we will take the appropriate initiatives with you, as we did before in other areas in that regard. It's very clear that it wasn't a technical problem that caused this. There wasn't a technical problem with the CAD system. It's old. It doesn't have the analytical capacity that its successor will have. But there was nothing mechanically wrong, to use that old phrase, with the system that caused calls to be cancelled, because the same system permitted very many calls to be handled properly and effectively. It was the decisions of individuals that caused calls to be cancelled. And one of the things that has struck us quite forcibly since it became clear that this wasn't there was more to this than we had been given to understand. Was that it appears to have been difficult for the organisation to move beyond the possibility of culpability and discipline to looking at these issues as the Garda Síochána as employer and the Garda Síochána as service provider, so that the way in which people respond to emergency calls in stressful circumstances is constantly evaluated and monitored and reflected on. I have seen, and we've heard today, the proposal for quarterly dip sampling. It seems to us that that is hopelessly inadequate, and that there should be a continuing process, if not day by day, then certainly week by week, of random samples of calls, the way in which they are handled. Every other call center operator will tell you when you call, this call is being recorded for monitoring and standard purposes. And it is deeply surprising, to put it at its very mildest, that there hasn't been that process of engagement or supervisory evaluation of the performance of calls in this absolutely critical area. To make two quick points, I said at the beginning that there were system problems or system issues that need to be evaluated, and some of them have been touched upon. Selection, training, renewal training, external involvement in the selection and training, using the skills of people whose constant work is in dealing with people in distress, taking the advice of people who understand the psychology of stress and distress, and introducing that into the entire process of this area. We've said often, and I've said repeatedly, the issue of discipline is not foremost in my mind. The issue of quality of response to vulnerable people and to concerned people is the critical issue. It is not, as you've said, it is not a job for everybody. And suitability needs to be determined at the point of entry. And it really did shock me that it took or appeared to take such a long time to begin to address that question, and I'm not sure to what extent it has been addressed, to be honest, of engaging with people who may be on duty tonight or tomorrow night, who may be responding to a 999 call tonight or tomorrow night, and whether they have been taken aside and encouraged, supported in ensuring that they get the right response. Speed, of course, is of the essence, but that is one of the key skills here, is the capacity to have speed and an understanding tone and a reassuring approach to people who are stressed, while at the same time being able to extract the clear information. Complex task, but that is the task. And I think that it has been said that the time of arrival by Gardaí on the scene from the time that they were dispatched is recorded and monitored. We have heard in Waterford and in Cork and in Galway from your colleagues that there are concerns about the extent to which this is not recorded, and so therefore not really amenable to being recorded. Perhaps more than any of the other substantive systemic issues that the authority has dealt with over the last 5.5 years, this is the one that touches most closely the potential for everybody to be affected by it, because none of us knows when we're going to be in a position of requiring the urgent assistance of the Garda Síochána. And therefore the urgency of ensuring that this is, that the effectiveness of this system at every level can be assured is a critical one. This has not been resolved. The removal of the power to cancel from the individuals does not solve the underlying issue of the fact that the calls were cancelled by individuals, whoever they were, at whatever stage they were. And removing that power to the supervisory level may shade the fact that these were human decisions. and that the people who made the bad decisions may not be getting the support to ensure that they don't make them in the future, and where necessary, face whatever appropriate consequences are to be faced. I appreciate the openness of your responses, Commissioner, today, and of your colleagues. And it is if only there had been that level of openness at the beginning of this episode in last October, and the willingness to share it, we might not be speaking with the same degree of energy as we have done in recent weeks and months. We will be coming back to this because there is unfinished business to be done, both by you and by us. And there is a large task ahead of us in ensuring that what needs to be resolved, fixed, improved, can be resolved, fixed and improved. And in the remaining period, because I know that there are other commitments awaiting you and us after this session today, can we move to the issue of policing during COVID-19 with particular reference, well, with reference also to public order policing, and Debbie, I think, is going to lead on this.
Thank you, Chair, and we're moving on to something really quite different. Well, there may well be threads, and it's hard to follow in terms of questioning on public order policing once you've heard the input from a victim's voice, and maybe we should hear more of that directly. But Commissioner, and we covered some of these issues in our previous committee meetings with some of your colleagues, and it's around COVID and public order policing, and there's a couple of things really that I want to explore with you. The first is in relation to some of the reflections on some of the public order incidents that happened in early June during the bank holiday weekend. And that sort of forms a context for these questions. So in terms of that, the public order policing, can you speak to us more generally about the planning process, the risk assessment process in determining the police in response? Can I ask you also to reflect on the extent to which public confidence plays into that planning? And then I have maybe some follow-up questions after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Anne-Marie Cagney to respond to the planning process and the risk assessment process. I think it was the weekend, the 4th, 5th and 6th was particularly difficult, but the weekend before that had also been difficult, and there'd been difficult incidents in the intervening weekdays as well. Anne-Marie Cagney, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, Deborah. Just to talk a little bit back to when planning for the bank holiday weekend in June began, was way back in May, when we in the GMR started looking at putting our plans together to approach policing of the city for that particular weekend. And I just want to be mindful of the fact that it's not a public order response is the first response, but public order does form part of the policing plans for policing the city, and has done so right throughout the COVID pandemic and continues to do so. We currently have public order supporting our policing plans every weekend, Friday, Saturday and Sunday here in the GMR. We review our plans on a regular basis, Deborah, and in planning for the weekend activities, we base our policing response on a number of matters. The reopening of society, as you're aware at the moment, is a considerable consideration. So that's based on the anticipated crowds, any anticipated incidents that may arise depending on demographics, any intelligence that may be in our possession to support perhaps protest activity in the city or other such related matters. And indeed, if you look at the planning for this weekend, we have Pride celebrations going on throughout the city. So there's a certain element of planning going into considerations of additional crowds in certain areas around that. So what we do is we look at the approach, we incorporate frontline response, and we incorporate a graduated policing response into the plans. And again, when matters arise which require the response from the public order units, they're already built into the plans, and they're affected by tactical persons on the ground. So if you look back to the incidents of the 4th and 5th of June, that's exactly what happened. The frontline response was in place, dealing with what you and I would consider standard incidents arising in policing of any city. And when matters got to such an extent that a public order response was required, a tactical decision was made on the ground to deploy in a tactical manner. And that was done on 2 occasions over that weekend. And then we had 2 nights throughout that bank holiday weekend where there were normal policing requirements for the frontline response only. So we review on a weekly basis, Deborah. We meet as a management team every Monday. We also meet every Friday in advance of the weekend, and we consider all of our approaches. And sometimes we tweak our approaches, and sometimes we build in additional matters into the plans, such as having silver commanders on and additional public order personnel on certain weekends when there are, say, the likes of protest activity or the likes of event celebrations right throughout the city. But I think it's important just to reassure you as well, a lot of development of plans are considered in consultation with key stakeholders in the community, and not just our business community, but again, residents as well form a key part of that, because their concerns are also taken on board when we put together our plans.
Okay, can I just, you mentioned a graduated response there, Anne-Marie, and you're still operating the 4 E's and you're working through those. But when you get to the 4th E, which is about enforcement, there are a range of options available. How in your planning do you go through those range of options, and at what stage do you decide on which options are appropriate? So for example, you mentioned that there was potentially some folk who were troublemakers, but not everyone who was present during that time fell into that category. So can you take us through that sort of range of options that you have available to you for the enforcement?
Thanks, Deborah. And again, just to reassure you that the 4 E's approach is very much a significant part of our policing response. But what we say in terms of the enforcement piece, it must be proportionate and it must be compliant with the human rights of individuals. And again, tactical decisions are made on the ground based on incidents that are happening and the level of risk to the community, the level of risk to members who are working in that particular area. And they're decisions that are made with all of that in mind. And again, in certain circumstances, intelligence may be received throughout the course of an evening to indicate that matters may be happening, which might require that additional response. So they're the types of matters that are considered by those tactical commanders in making decisions on enforcement. Then if you look at the decisions by individual members, and again, individual members making decisions must do so based on the decision-making model, and they must have a rationale for their decisions. And again, we do examine those a little bit further in certain instances. And if you look at the matters of the 4th and 5th of June, where members utilised their ASP batons on those occasions, they are subject of an investigation by me and an examination to make sure that they were proportionate and done in the correct manner and that they were required. So just to reassure you that that is done by me as well at regional level to make sure that the response is proportionate.
In terms of the learning then, Anne-Marie, from each of those incidents, can you talk us through the process of review and learning, and then how you apply the learning, and if there was any particular learning from those 2 weekends that you are now applying to similar situations that may arise in the future?
Thanks, Deborah. And the learnings are particularly important, and they are subject of many discussions with myself and the management team, and they in turn discuss them with their membership on the ground. I would say one of the learnings from the weekend of the bank holiday weekend was that early engagement is vital. And when I say early engagement, I mean lots of yellow jackets out on the ground, engaging with our communities, reassuring them of our presence, reassuring them of the safety and reassuring them of our support in supporting the reopening of society. And that's the approach we've taken the last number of weekends. And if you can see, we've had a number of incidents which were, serious enough and did require consideration of the deployment of public order. But we didn't have to deploy them, Deborah, because we found that frontline policing response was very effective because we had people out early, people out engaging, and just reminding people of their personal responsibility. And people love to be reminded of that because it does empower them to be part of the policing response. And again, a lot of our learnings are from that stakeholder engagement piece, making sure that they're satisfied with our response and making sure that even the communities themselves are satisfied with our response, because they all form part of our considerations. And I think what's particularly important is that proportionate response and that sense of fairness for our communities. It really does need to be built into the plans.
We've heard, a criticism that maybe some of your planning focuses more on the interests of the commercial and business areas of Dublin, and not so much maybe on the residents and the people who use those public spaces. How would you respond to that, Anne-Marie?
I certainly would like to reassure you, Deborah, that all of the stakeholders are very, very important in terms of our considerations of the development and execution of our plans. And yes, we do engage with the business community, but we also engage with the residents as well. And even if I look at the weekends, I'm not identifying particular areas because I don't want to do that, but we've had a number of calls from concerned residents in a number of areas that will get additional policing responses this weekend. And even if you look at other areas over the last number of weeks, we've very closely listened to the concerns of residents and have built such responses into our plans, because it's important, as I said, that everybody has a voice here, and all of those voices need to be heard and need to be included in our plans.
Okay, thank you. Anne-Marie, we're really quite pushed for time this afternoon, understandably, but I have one more question, Commissioner, maybe that you can answer. In recent days, we've heard quite a bit about the use of Garda discretion.
Yep.
Now, it's in a particular circumstances, but this has wider implications. Can you provide us with an outline of the guidance that Garda at frontline have, the clarity in which they understand the circumstances in which they can use their discretion, and the governance that surrounds the use of discretion in terms of ensuring that it is fairly and equitably used right across the board? In other words, in the current circumstances, can you ensure that two people in two different areas who are standing outside with a pint will both be treated equally and the discretion used consistently? Thank you.
Well, the particular circumstances of this week actually flow on from precisely what we've been talking about. So we know when drinking is happening in a pretty unregulated way, so either just carry out pints or carry out cans of beer, etc., that inevitably then it becomes an issue of public nuisance, noise, and then regrettably then disorder and indeed violence. And that's what we saw in the last over 2 weekends. Now, the situation changed entirely whenever licensed premises opened up for, in effect, external meals or individuals being able to consume alcohol outside their premises. And that's positive, because immediately then there's a different age cohort, and there's more individuals there who are out for, in effect, a traditional night out, and it calms the whole thing down. And that we've seen that right across the country. It's just a change of atmosphere, and given the wider context around licensing laws in the first place, but you set that in the wider context of preventing crime and the preservation of the peace, it's entirely then appropriate to say, when we're looking at licensed premises, that we exercise discretion about the outside areas that they provide, either for the consumption of meals or consumption of drinks. So that is why that is done. But discretion has in effect an element of it which is difficult to define. It's for the more minor instances. It's bound by our own decision-making model. People need to be able to stand over their interactions with the public and where they exercise discretion. But it's very difficult actually then to prescribe how it's going to be used, because it will vary in the circumstances that members from Garda Síochána find. But if you look at it's only one disposal. There's other disposals that are available to members of Garda Síochána, and it is only at a minor level, and it gives opportunities in effect for an individual to get advice at the side of the road or in the evening time, and in effect sent on their way. And able to retrieve the situation. So it's an essential part of policing, but it defies some definition. We do expect people to operate within the Garda decision-making model. I've already set that out. There is guidance that we have internally, but again, it fails to hit the nail on the head as well, because we're talking about a whole range of situations and the circumstances and the context dictate the response.
Okay, Commissioner, thank you. That's me, Chair.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Commissioner. Are there any other comments or questions on this particular issue of public order or COVID-19? No. I've taken a democratic decision that we will defer consideration of roads policing. It is too significant to try to shoehorn it into the time that we've left, which inevitably probably has become shortened because of the proper focus on the CAD 999 issues. I will talk to the Commissioner, and I'm sorry for bouncing this on you, Commissioner. I will talk to you in the next couple of days about the possibility of converting part of our meeting in July next month to be a public meeting, which hadn't been our intention, so that we might deal with the question of roads policing. It will not be a full afternoon session, and it will not necessarily involve a significant disruption of the time of your senior colleagues, but so my apologies to those who were expecting to ask and to respond to questions on roads policing, but I think it's the correct thing to do.
That might be very useful, because by the end of July we may be able to give a further update, and the next public meeting not till September, so it might be that might work out very well.
Thank you for that understanding, Commissioner, and we can, as we say, pick up on perhaps on the other issue too at that time. Under any other business, there were two questions I was going to ask you, Commissioner. The first relates to something that has been touched on already, and that is the move from Harcourt Square to the Military Road site when that's completed, and inevitably to other destinations as well because of the additional people. One of the critical elements in that will be the moving of those individuals and units of the Garda Síochána that are based, and services that are based in Harcourt Square. Are you confident that the timescale in terms of knowing exactly when the project will be ready, when Military Road will be ready for occupation, that the smooth and timely removal, I don't like the term decant, but that's the one that's used, removal of people from Harcourt Square to the new premises can be effected within what may be a tight timescale?
Well, it's getting a tighter timescale nearly as the week goes by, because actually to empty Harcourt Square of all our material is quite a considerable undertaking in itself. So if I can turn to Joe, because that's a specific element and quite a big element of actually all of this. You know, it's not going to be a question of people lifting a plastic bag of stuff. Like the amount of material we have in Harcourt Square is very considerable. So Joe, please, just the logistics of that. Thank you.
Apologies if my line is dropping in and dropping out, so if you're struggling to hear me, apologies in advance. There is a project in place to look at the whole logistical issues around the move. And Katrina Clifford and her colleagues in estate management have been working on that and looking at that issue. So there's a further meeting on that next week. So we're aware of just the logistical issues, never mind the requirement to do that. So we are ahead of ourselves in some ways, and that remains uncertain as we speak, but hopefully we'll get more clarity on that within the next 3 to 4 weeks, and that will allow us to proceed further. But yes, we are aware, Bob, exactly of the challenges you're suggesting, and we're preparing for that already.
Thank you. Moving house is a significant enough task, but moving the significant resource that's in Harcourt Square is a mammoth task, and we'll come back to that. I just wanted to get your preliminary and somewhat reassured.
It would be made all the more easier if we actually knew where we were going as well. So those are the discussions we need to actually finalise there as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, I understand that point, Commissioner. The other point I wanted to raise under any other business is something that arises from your own report to us. And in your reference to the anti-corruption unit, which has become fully operational, perhaps without its full complement of people at this stage still, but already you identify a range of investigative tasks in which they're involved. And the question, as I read that, question struck me whether the resources available were sufficient to that task and to the task that is being set for that overall function within the organisation.
Well, it certainly has to grow beyond where it is at the moment, and that will be the work of the next 6 months. But also then we've also further supplemented units belonging to John O'Driscoll MBCI, who are undertaking investigations relating to Limerick, and we further supplemented those. So there are a number. There's a major investigation there, obviously, but also then ACU has picked up and is picking up more investigative work, either in terms of investigations or following down on intelligence, and also then work with other agencies, principally GSOC. So they too have a resourcing issue that we're going to have to follow through on.
Okay, because it strikes us that in relation to a number of, and this goes beyond the anti-corruption unit, that a number of critical areas the organisation identifies significant needs for additional support to enable them to do fully what you want them to do. And clearly one of the very clear and measurable impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic was the reduction in the number of newly attested Gardaí because of the limitation on training. How soon do you think that issue is going to resolve itself so that you would be able to, at least within limits, to deploy additional resources to those areas where you identify them as being necessary, additional Gardaí? Well, overall, the resourcing picture is pretty much marking time this year. Number of people who are coming in and then the cessations pretty much balance each other out. Next year, we'll have a new recruitment campaign in the winter, and we're hoping to recruit upwards of 800 members next year. So that'll allow then for considerable movement. There are various demands: cybercrime, economic crime bureau, ACU, and then into the normal investigative bureaus as well. We are servicing them as best we can. But some of it actually does come down to accommodation as well, and meeting those particular challenges as well. So we're doing what we can in the year that we have at this time. But I have to say, on a lot of the resources, given that we're marking time this year, as I say, in terms of people coming in and people leaving, I've run out a bit of road, and I'll have to wait. Some people are going to have to wait next year to see the full complement. Thank you. Thanks, Commissioner. Is there any other issue under this item that anybody wishes to raise? If not, can I then say thank you, Commissioner, to you and your colleagues for what I think has been a very useful and effective engagement this afternoon and a very valuable exploration of some, at least, of the issues that arise in the CAD 999 question. And as I said earlier, we will no doubt be returning to it not infrequently over the next while. So thank you very much to everybody, and this meeting is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you.